The Harrowfield Hotel had a particular kind of quiet that only very old buildings understand, the kind that settles into the walls over decades, that absorbs the footsteps of 1,000 guests and gives nothing back. 42 floors of glass and limestone rising above the waterfront in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The kind of place where the elevator doors opened without a sound, and the carpets were so thick they swallowed your footsteps whole. Declan Whitford had owned it for 11 years. He stood now at the floor-to-ceiling window of his private suite on the 38th floor, a glass of water in his hand, untouched, watching the fog roll off the harbor the way it did every morning in October. The container ships moved slowly through it. He envied them, sometimes. The straightforward mathematics of cargo, weight, destination, arrival time. No ambiguity in that. He had a board meeting in 3 hours and hadn't slept. Not because of the meeting. The meeting he could manage in his sleep, had managed things far more complicated than quarterly projections in states, far worse than tired. No. What had kept him awake was something smaller, almost embarrassingly small, for a man of his position to be troubled by. It was the new housekeeper on the 14th floor. Her name, according to the staff registry he'd pulled at 11:30 the previous night, was Audrey Sinclair, 31 years old. Previously employed at a care home in Truro for 6 years, before that a brief stint at a mid-range hotel in Moncton. References described her as quiet, thorough, and unusually reliable. No disciplinary record, no performance issues. She had started at Harrowfield 3 weeks ago and had not, in that time, accepted a single gratuity from any guest or staff member. Not one. In a hotel where guests routinely left 50s on pillows, where some staff had been known to keep informal tallies of their best tipping weeks, Audrey Sinclair had returned everything, quietly, without fanfare, without explanation beyond a soft, apologetic smile and the same phrase repeated each time. "That's very kind, but I really can't." Jonathan Reeve, the floor manager, had mentioned it to Declan almost as an afterthought during a staffing update. "She's good," he'd said. "Better than good, actually. Guests keep commenting in the feedback forms. But she won't take tips, doesn't even seem tempted." Declan had nodded and moved on to the next item on the agenda, but he hadn't stopped thinking about it. He turned away from the window and set the glass down on the writing desk. He had learned, in 11 years of running hotels and before that in the harder school of watching his father run them, that people who seemed too good usually weren't. That performance and integrity were very different things, and that the distance between them was most visible, not in what people did when they were being watched, but in the moments when they believed they weren't. His father had told him a story, once, sitting in the back office of the original Harrowfield property on the South Shore, the one that had burned down in the renovation of 2009. He'd told it without sentiment, the way he told most things. There had been a head of housekeeping, years before Declan was involved in the business, a woman who had worked for the family for nearly a decade, whom his father had trusted with the master key, with the petty cash, with the kind of small daily confidences that accumulate between a property owner and long-standing staff. She had left one Tuesday morning with $4,200 from the main safe and a set of silverware that had belonged to his grandmother. She'd given 2 weeks' notice the previous Friday, professional to the end. His father had not been angry. Exactly. He'd been something worse, resigned. As though he had always known, and had simply been waiting for confirmation. "Don't hire for warmth," his father had said. "Hire for consistency. And even then, watch." Declan had watched ever since. He pulled on his jacket. He had a 7:30 walkthrough scheduled, the kind he conducted himself every few weeks. Unannounced, unhurried, the kind his operations manager called unnecessary and his head of security called good practice. Declan called it the only reliable way to see anything true about the hotel he ran. He took the service elevator to the 14th floor. The corridor was empty except for a housekeeping cart parked outside room 1407. Its neat rows of folded towels and miniature toiletries arranged with more precision than was strictly required. A woman was working inside, the door half open. He could hear the quiet efficiency of her movements, the snap of a fresh pillowcase, the soft drag of fabric against the mattress. He didn't go in. He stood at the end of the hallway instead, far enough back that he wouldn't be visible through the doorway, and waited. Audrey Sinclair emerged 4 minutes later carrying a stack of used linens. She was younger than he'd imagined from the file, or perhaps she simply looked it. Her hair was dark and pulled back neatly beneath a white clip. Her uniform was pressed, her shoes practical and plain. She moved to the cart without looking up, set the linens in the lower basket, checked something on the notepad, clipped to the side of the cart. And then, and this was the part that made Declan stay, she paused. She looked back at room 1407. She'd already closed the door. She stared at it for a moment, then opened it again and went back inside. He heard the sound of a drawer being opened and then closed. When she came out again, she was carrying a single earring, small and silver, which she set carefully into a small Ziploc bag and wrote something on the notepad. A found item, to be turned in at the front desk. The room had already been cleaned. She had already been finished. She'd gone back in for a single earring left behind in a drawer that no one would have noticed missing for days, if at all. Declan walked back to the elevator and said nothing to anyone. He arranged it 10 days later. He told no one except Jonathan Reeve, and even then he kept the specifics minimal. He needed the small conference room on the 14th floor to be accessible during the Thursday afternoon shift. He needed the adjoining storage room unlocked. He needed, on the round table in the center of the conference room, a specific arrangement of items, a leather portfolio embossed with the hotel's crest, a set of room keys for the executive suites, an unsealed envelope containing $300 in cash, presented solely, casually, as though someone had simply forgotten it there. Jonathan Reeve had looked at him for a long moment. "You're testing her," he'd said. Declan hadn't confirmed or denied it. "I need the room set up by 1:30, he'd said. He spent the hour before in the storage room, the door cracked an inch, his phone in his hand, a novel he couldn't concentrate on propped open on a box of extra pillow inserts. He had a view, partial but sufficient, of the conference room table and the door through which Audrey Sinclair would enter during her afternoon round. He heard her before he saw her, the quiet knock of the cartwheels, the soft mechanical protest of the door swinging open. She entered the way she seemed to do everything, with attention but without drama. She scanned the room, first the way experienced housekeeping staff did, cataloging what needed to be done, the table, the credenza along the far wall, the window. She moved to the window first, straightening the blinds with 2 adjustments, then turned to the credenza. She hadn't noticed the envelope yet, or if she had, she was ignoring it. She dusted the credenza surface methodically, moving a framed photograph of the Halifax skyline, wiping beneath it, replacing it at the same angle. She moved to the table. She saw the envelope then. He could tell by the slight change in her posture, a barely perceptible stillness that lasted less than 2 seconds before she continued wiping down the far edge of the table. She worked her way toward it. Declan's jaw had tightened without his noticing. When she reached the envelope, she stopped. She looked at it for a moment. She didn't touch the money. She lifted the envelope by its corner, looked inside briefly, then set it back down. She went to her cart, retrieved a small card printed with the hotel's lost and found protocol, and placed it on top of the envelope. Then she took out her notepad and wrote something down, a record of what she'd found, he assumed, and where, and when. She left the conference room without touching a cent. Declan stayed in the storage room for another 4 minutes after she'd gone. He didn't move. He was trying to identify what it was that he felt, and finding it more difficult than expected. It wasn't relief, exactly. It wasn't the simple satisfaction of hypothesis confirmed. It was something less comfortable, something closer to the recognition that he had been testing a person the way you tested a lock, and she had passed without ever knowing she was being measured, and the asymmetry of that, the basic unfairness of it, landed somewhere beneath his ribs with unexpected weight. He put the novel back on the shelf and went to his office. In the weeks that followed, Declan began to notice things he hadn't before. Whether they had always been there and he had simply not been looking, or whether some adjustment in his attention had made them visible, he couldn't say. He noticed that the plants in the corridor outside the 14th floor vending alcove, a pair of small succulents that had been there since the renovation, largely forgotten, were being watered. He knew because they had visibly recovered from what had been a prolonged and deepening neglect, and when he checked the maintenance log, there was no entry for it. He noticed that a handwritten note had appeared in the break room on the service floor, taped to the cabinet above the coffee machine. The kettle on the left runs hot, closer to 100 than 95. Good for black tea, not great for green. A small thing. Useful if you knew about it. Unasked for, he noticed that an elderly guest in room 1412, a man named Terence Boudreau, 83 years old, in Halifax visiting his daughter, had mentioned in his checkout survey that a member of the housekeeping staff had spent 15 minutes helping him locate a phone number for a medical supply rental company when his travel walker developed a problem. She'd looked it up on her own phone, on her own time, between her assigned rooms. She hadn't asked to be thanked. She hadn't given her name. Terence Boudreau had described her only as the quiet one with the dark hair. Declan read that survey twice. He didn't speak to Audrey Sinclair directly. He wasn't sure at that point what he would say. The dynamic between a hotel owner and a member of his housekeeping staff was not complicated in theory. There was a chain of command. There were proper channels. There was a professional distance that existed for good and structural reasons. He was aware of all of this. He was also aware that he had started taking the service elevator more often than was strictly necessary. It was Jonathan Reeve who told him about the photographs. One of the long corridors on the 14th floor had a small alcove between the ice machine and the stairwell door, an odd architectural feature from the original build that had never been given much use. Someone had begun leaving things there. Not clutter, arrangements almost. A small glass vase with a sprig of dried lavender, a laminated card printed with the morning tide times from the Halifax waterfront, changed every 3 days. At some point a black and white photograph had appeared, a vintage image of the original harbor, fishing boats and fog, the kind of thing you'd find in the antique market on Barrington Street. Jonathan Reeve thought it was charming. Wondered if it should be made official, incorporated into the aesthetic somehow. Declan had walked down to look at it himself. He stood in the alcove for longer than he'd intended, studying the photograph. There was no name on it, no explanation, just someone making something more beautiful than it needed to be. In a corner of the building where almost no one would notice. He knew who it was. He found her on a Wednesday evening in November, later than she should have been there. Her shift had ended at 4. It was nearly 6:30. He was heading to the service exit when he saw her in the small outdoor courtyard between the east wing and the maintenance yard. A utilitarian space, not intended for anything except smoking breaks and deliveries, with a single wooden bench that had been there since long before his time. She was sitting on the bench with her coat pulled tight and her hands folded in her lap, and she was crying. Not dramatically, quietly, the way some people do when they've learned to keep things small. A controlled kind of grief, shoulders barely moving, face tilted slightly down. Declan stopped. He should have continued walking. He was aware of this. He was also aware that he had stopped, and that standing in a doorway watching someone cry was not a significant improvement over any of the other things he was aware he should not be doing. He stepped back inside before she saw him, but he did not go far. He waited in the corridor, doing nothing in particular, until he heard the courtyard door open and her quiet footsteps move toward the service stairs. The following morning, Declan arrived in the 14th floor break room at 7:15, before the morning shift assembled. He made 2 cups of tea, one in the mug with the hotel crest, one in the plain white mug that he'd noticed. Over several unacknowledged observations she seemed to prefer. He left them on the counter. Beside the plain one, a folded note. Your wage advance for the next 2 weeks has been processed. It should appear by end of day. D.W. He didn't sign it with his title. He didn't explain. He went back to his office and spent the next hour looking at reports he retained nothing from. He learned later, from Jonathan Reeve, that she had stood in the break room for a long time holding the note, that she had asked quietly whether there had been an error in the payroll system. She had not asked who D.W. was, but she had not thrown the note away, either. The incident with the corporate inspection happened on a Thursday, the 2nd week of December, when the regional director from the hospitality group that held a minority interest in Harrowfield arrived for what was nominally a routine facilities review and was, in practice, a prolonged performance of authority by a man named Robert Kane, who had been trying to push Declan toward a rebranding for 3. Robert Kane was the kind of man who moved through hotel corridors as though appraising livestock. He had opinions about everything and information about nothing, and he expressed both with equal confidence. He had brought with him an associate, a younger man who shadowed him silently and took notes on a tablet, and together they had spent the morning conducting a review that was equal parts genuinely useful and deeply irritating. The problem occurred in the early afternoon. Robert Kane had been inspecting the executive floor linen service when he encountered Audrey Sinclair in the corridor outside the housekeeping station. He had looked at her cart, at the arranged items on it, at the laminated protocol cards she kept clipped along the side, and had made a remark, delivered to his associate rather than to her, in the tone of a man accustomed to being overheard, that the presentation of service carts said a great deal about the overall caliber of a property's staff. It was not, in itself, an offensive remark, but the way he'd said it, looking at her, and then past her, as though completing an assessment, had evidently registered with Jonathan Reeve, who was accompanying the inspection, because Jonathan had mentioned it to Declan during the afternoon debrief. And then, 2 hours later, Robert Kane had complained. He had been in the lobby when Audrey Sinclair, finishing her shift, had walked through carrying a box of items from the lost and found to be logged, the routine end-of-week submission. A small decorative pin had been sitting on top of the box, found in one of the suites that morning. Robert Kane had said loud enough for the front desk staff to hear that it was unusual for housekeeping personnel to be carrying guest belongings through the main lobby without visible supervisory oversight, and that the optics of it were something Declan might want to address. The implication was thin but unmistakable, the kind of suggestion that didn't have to be made explicitly to do its damage. Declan had been at the front desk when it happened. He had heard it. He watched Audrey Sinclair's face as the remark registered. She had gone very still, not with shock, but with something more practiced than that. Something that looked uncomfortably like recognition, the way a person goes still when they encounter something that has happened to them before. She looked at the box in her hands. She looked at the front desk clerk, who had looked away, uncertain what to do. She said nothing. Declan spoke before he'd decided to. "Mr. Kane," he said, and his voice came out very even, "the lost and found submission process is a protocol I established myself. The lobby is the correct route. And if you'd like to review the chain of custody documentation for any items currently in that box, I'll have it on your desk within the hour." Robert Kane looked at him. A beat of recalibration. "Of course," he said. "No issue, just observing." Declan looked at Audrey Sinclair. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, "thank you, you can proceed." She nodded, a small, careful nod, and walked to the office corridor. After Robert Kane had moved on, Declan found her in the staff office completing the log entry. She didn't look up immediately when he came in. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked up then. "You were right to follow protocol," he said. "Exactly right, and I'm sorry you had to navigate that without warning." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Has this happened before? With him?" "He's been difficult before," Declan said. "Not usually in that direction." "I'm used to being difficult for people to look at," she said, without bitterness, just matter of fact. And then, as though she hadn't intended to say something quite that honest, she looked back down at the log. Declan pulled a chair out and sat down across from her. He wasn't sure he'd ever sat in this office. It was small and faintly harshly lit and smelled of cleaning solution and paper. "Something happened before," he said. "At a previous job. It wasn't a question quite." She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him. She'd worked for 6 years at a residential care home in Truro. Her last year there, a resident, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Gallant, had been moved to palliative care. Audrey had spent a lot of time with her in those last weeks, reading to her, mostly. Crime novels, which Mrs. Gallant found calming. When Mrs. Gallant passed, her family had come to collect her belongings and found that a small ceramic brooch, a thing of no particular value, sentimental only, was missing from the nightstand. Someone had suggested Audrey might know where it was. She hadn't. She had been investigated informally, which was already more than it should have been, and when the brooch turned up 2 weeks later in a laundry bin, it had fallen from the nightstand and been swept up during a linen change. No one had said anything to her directly. She had simply noticed that her hours were reduced, that she was no longer assigned to the palliative ward, and that the charge nurse who'd always been warm to her was suddenly very busy whenever Audrey came near. She had resigned 6 months later. "I didn't take it," she said. The words were flat and certain, not defensive, just true. "I know," Declan said. She looked at him. "You do?" "I know the difference," he said, "between someone hiding something and someone who's learned to expect not to be believed." The fluorescent light above the filing cabinet flickered once and held. Outside in the corridor, someone pushed a cart past the door. "I almost left last month," she said, after the inspection walkthrough. The way Mr. Kane spoke in the corridor. She stopped. "I know," Declan said again, "and because he owed her at least this." It took me this long to say so directly. She didn't say. It was fine. He appreciated that. She just looked at him with an expression that was thoughtful and a little tired, and underneath both of those things, something careful, like a door that had been closed for a long time, Not locked, just closed, and she was deciding whether to push it open. Winter settled over Halifax without ceremony. The harbor froze at its edges and the fog came in early and stayed late, and Harrowfield's occupancy numbers climbed as people from the city booked staycations to avoid the highways, and a quiet steadiness took hold of the hotel that Declan, in 11 years, had not quite felt before. He began joining the morning staff briefing occasionally, not to observe, or to audit, just to be there. It was something he'd seen his father do, once, in the early years, before the company had grown large enough that such things became impractical. He'd forgotten the value of it. Standing in the same room as the people who actually ran the hotel, at 7 in the morning, before anything had gone right or wrong yet. Audrey Sinclair attended the briefing on the days her shift started at 7. She didn't speak often. When she did, it was specific and useful. A note about a fixture that needed attention in 1421. A question about the protocol for guests who requested blackout curtains not available in standard supply. She never editorialized. She never stayed afterward to catch anyone's attention. One morning in January, Declan arrived early and found her already in the briefing room, sitting with a notebook open, writing. She didn't hear him come in. The door was heavy and he was wearing the quieter shoes his physiotherapist had recommended after a knee issue the previous autumn. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not intending to eavesdrop on something that was clearly private, and then she looked up. There was a half-second of mutual adjustment, the kind that happens between two people who are not quite sure yet what the other is to them. "Sorry," he said. "Early start." "Me too," she said. She closed the notebook. He could have left. He made coffee instead, from the machine in the corner that produced a result considerably better than it had any right to given its age. And then, without consulting himself about whether it was a good idea, he sat down 2 seats away with his cup and opened his phone. They didn't talk. But the silence had a different quality than the other silences he'd experienced in that room alone, and he noticed it, and filed it somewhere without a label, and moved on with his morning. There was a night in February when the building's heating system developed a pressure issue on floors 12 through 15, and the engineering team worked through the night to address it, while affected guests were temporarily relocated to higher floors, and the housekeeping team, who had no obligation to be there, mostly showed up anyway. Declan was in the mechanical room at 11:30 when Jonathan Reeve appeared in the doorway and said that Audrey Sinclair had come in. Off the clock, she'd seen the call on the staff app and was helping coordinate the room transfers on 14. Declan went up. The floor was organized chaos, the kind that looks like panic from the outside but is, if you know what you're looking at, actually competence under pressure. Guests were being guided to temporary rooms, extra blankets were being distributed, small apologies were being delivered, with the particular grace that the best hospitality staff managed without it seeming scripted. Audrey Sinclair was at the center of it, clipboard in hand, methodical, calm, her voice low and steady. He watched her tell an elderly woman in a dressing gown that her room on the 22nd floor was ready, that her medications had been moved by her own hands, that there were 2 extra pillows waiting, because Mrs. Collinson had mentioned a neck issue during check-in 3 days ago, and Audrey had written it in her notes. Mrs. Collinson looked at her for a moment and then reached out and patted her hand and said, "You're a kind girl." Audrey smiled the way she did when she was trying not to show that something had landed. A small compression, something pressed carefully inward. When the floor had quieted and the last of the affected guests had been settled, Declan found her in the corridor, winding down the cart. "You didn't have to come in," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you." He paused. "Is there something you need? From the hotel, I mean. Formally, a schedule adjustment, anything. If tonight put you out at all, I want to." "I'm fine," she said. He nodded. He should have stopped there. Instead he said, "I saw you, a few months ago, in the courtyard. In the evening." She went still. "I didn't say anything," he said. "I should have. I'm still not sure what I would have said." She looked at him. The corridor was empty. The heating system had been restored and the vents were ticking warmly back to life. "My mother was sick," she said after a moment. "She passed in September. I hadn't told anyone here." "I'm sorry," he said. And then, because she looked like a person who was tired of being handled carefully, "Was she? Did you have time with her at the end?" Audrey looked at him with something that shifted, slightly, in her expression. Surprised, perhaps, that he'd ask something real rather than something polite. "Some," she said. "She was in Cape Breton. I drove up on my days off." She paused. She would have liked this hotel. Tell me something about her, Declan said. It was an unusual thing to say. He was aware of that. He said it anyway. Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then, she used to collect lighthouse photographs. She had them all over the kitchen. Ones she'd taken herself, mostly. She drove to every lighthouse in Nova Scotia over about 15 years, whenever she had a free weekend. She was a practical woman, not sentimental. But she said there was something honest about lighthouses, that they didn't pretend to be anything except what they were. The heating vent above them clicked twice and settled. She sounds like someone worth knowing, Declan said. Audrey looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "Someone who counted things." He almost said, "I do count things." He decided not to. "So did I," he said instead. "About you." Her expression shifted in a way he couldn't entirely read, thoughtful and a little wary, and something else, something that might, under other circumstances, have been called almost warm. She said goodnight and walked toward the service stairs, and Declan stood in the corridor for a moment before heading back to the elevator, the heating ticking steadily around him, the hotel finding its way back to itself. Spring came the way it does in Halifax reluctantly, and then, all at once, the harbor ice loosening and the fog thinning to something almost translucent, and the days arriving with more generosity than anyone quite believed they've deserved after February. Declan arranged the scholarship without telling her. He had looked into it in November, initially in a passing way and then with increasing intention, the continuing education program at the Health Sciences faculty. A nursing pathway, compressed, well-structured, the kind of program that required recommendation letters and evidence of prior care work and a not insignificant amount of application effort. He had submitted, through the Whitford Foundation's Educational Fund, a nomination. He had written one of the letters himself, not as her employer, but as someone who had watched her work for 8 months and could say, with more certainty than most things he'd said in recent years, that she was someone who should be given the chance to do more. He did not tell her he had done it. The letter arrived for her at the hotel in March. They had the address on file. Jonathan Reeve mentioned that she had received a piece of official correspondence, somewhat surprised, and Declan had said nothing. He'd gone back to reviewing the winter cost reports and waited. She came to his office 2 days later. She knocked, which she never did. She had no reason to visit his office, had never done so in the 8 months she'd worked there. He said, "Come in," and she entered and stood just inside the door, holding a letter, and looked at him. "This came from the Whitford Foundation," she said. "I know," he said. "It says full tuition and housing support." She looked at the letter, "And a recommendation letter. One of the letters is from you." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," he said. "You wouldn't have." She was quiet. He let the quiet sit. "Why?" she asked finally. He thought about several answers. He chose the one that was true. "Because you're very good at what you do here," he said, "and I think you're meant to do something else. That's not a contradiction." She looked at the letter again. Her hands were very still. "I'm afraid," she said. She said it plainly, without apology. "That's reasonable," he said. "I've been afraid before and stayed somewhere too small," she said. "I know," he said. And then, when you go, that's what this is for, not to keep you here." She looked up. Something moved in her expression, quiet and significant, the way things sometimes shift in a room when a window is opened. "Thank you, Mr. Whitford," she said. "Declan," he said. She smiled. A small, real smile, the kind he'd catalogued without meaning to over 8 months. Rare, and therefore worth something. She said goodnight, even though it was 2 in the afternoon, and walked back out of his office, and he sat at his desk for some time afterward, with the cost reports untouched in front of him, watching the harbor through the window, the fog lifting slowly off the water in long pale ribbons. She left Harrowfield in April. Her last day was quiet, the way she would have wanted it. No fuss, no gathered staff, just a handshake from Jonathan Reeve, who appeared to be managing an emotional response he would never admit to, and a brief professional exchange with the facilities team she'd worked alongside. She stopped by Declan's office at the end of the day. He had been expecting it, and also somehow not ready for it. She was in her own clothes, a dark coat, a gray scarf, the kind of low-key presentation that had over 8 months become identifiable to him the way very specific things become identifiable when you've been paying attention to them longer than you planned. She was carrying a small tote bag and looked like someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it, which was something Declan found, at that moment, both admirable and considerably inconvenient. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, properly. "You don't need to," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." She set something on his desk. A small photograph in a simple frame, a lighthouse, Nova Scotia coastline, gray water and white tower, and the low autumn light of a good clear day. "It was hers," she said. "I thought it belonged somewhere with a view." Declan looked at it for a moment. "If you ever want to," he started. He wasn't sure how to finish that sentence, and she seemed to understand that, and she saved him from finishing it. "The hotel will still be here," she said, "and so will the view." He walked her to the lobby. They shook hands at the door, formal and a little absurd given everything, and she went out into the spring afternoon and turned left toward the waterfront, her coat lifting slightly in the harbor wind. He went back to his office. He set the lighthouse photograph on the windowsill, angled to catch the light. 7 months later, on a Tuesday in November, the courtyard door opened. Declan heard it from the corridor, the particular sound of the latch, which had developed a slight catch since July that the maintenance team had not yet gotten to. He looked up from the report he was annotating and went to the window overlooking the small courtyard. The wooden bench was there, same as always, and on it, sitting with a canvas bag at her feet, and her face tipped up slightly to the gray November sky, was Audrey Sinclair. She had cut her hair a little shorter. She was wearing a different coat. She looked in some way he couldn't precisely specify, more settled in herself. Not changed, but less careful about concealment, as though she had spent the last 7 months getting some practice at taking up the space she was owed. He went downstairs. She heard the door and stood, and when she saw him she said, "I wasn't sure you'd still be here." "Where would I go?" he said. "I don't know. Somewhere more interesting." "I find this place interesting enough," he said. She smiled. She reached into the canvas bag and produced, wrapped in a sheet of plain paper, something small and flat. He took it and unwrapped it. It was a photograph, printed, not framed, the kind of casual production that suggested it was the object that mattered, not the presentation. The Harrowfield Hotel taken from the waterfront. The building in the afternoon light, the harbor in the foreground, fog beginning to gather at the edges. "I took it in September," she said. "When I drove back through, I thought you should have one too. A view from the outside." He held the photograph and looked at her. There were things he had not said over the past 7 months which had accumulated the way things accumulate when you don't deal with them. Not heavily, but noticeably, a particular kind of weight that was not unpleasant to carry but was a weight nonetheless. "How's the program?" he said. "Hard," she said. "Good hard. The kind where you're tired but it makes sense." "Good," he said. "How's the hotel?" "Good," he said. "Quieter, in some ways, but good." She looked at him for a moment. "You're doing that thing where you have something to say and you're deciding whether to say it." He considered denying it. He did not. "I've thought about you," he said. "About the conversation in the corridor in February. About several things I didn't say, such as," she said. He said, "I think I've been counting things my whole career. Occupancy rates, revenue projections, trust margins, liability, and I think I started counting the wrong things for a long time." She waited. "I think you were right," he said. "I was someone who counted things. I'm trying to be someone who notices them instead." She was quiet for a moment. The harbor wind came through the courtyard and lifted the edge of the photograph in his hand. "That's a start," she said, and there was something in her voice that was careful but not closed. A door, not locked, pushed gently open. They went inside when the cold came properly and sat in the small staff kitchen on the ground floor with 2 cups of tea and talked until the light outside went dark and the hotel settled into its evening rhythm around them, the quiet and reliable heartbeat of a place that had been, all along, exactly what it had always needed to be. Somewhere real people found each other, in between all the ordinary things.